Fares will double in March. Unless the law is changed or borough councils step in, pensioners' free travel will end 10 days later. Another big fares increase will come in October. Fares then could be 3 times what they are now. We'll be waiting longer for a bus or tube because services will have been cut back. A 6-hour debate at County Hall ended in defeat for Ken Livingstone by just 3 votes. He could have won. The Labour group came out in favour of breaking the law by 24 votes to 21. But a Tory mass abstention to put them on the spot failed when 3 Tory rebels joined the 2 SDP and lone Liberal councillors to give Labour moderates what proved to be crucial extra votes. The council leader says a united Labour group backed by the LT unions will now lead a London-wide campaign to persuade the government to bring in urgent new legislation.
From public transport in London.
It also, I think, is a very clever play on words because the Council has before it today a proposal to transfer into Section 137 money, £10 million, which will allow us to continue to fund the concessionary scheme until the 1st of April. We will be able to use Section 137 to continue the present scheme beyond the 1st of April. So the Secretary of State's very clever play on words is true. Yes, it is possible to continue the scheme with the use of Section 137 money, but only until the 1st of April. I'm certain Council today will vote to do that, but we have to accept that we cannot operate a free travel system for pensioners out of Section 137 because it would be unlawful to do so. We would have to find £67 million. The legal limit for the expenditure under Section 137 is under 40 million.
Vice Chair of the Finance and Services Committee, 100 petitions have been received proposing the council supplementary rate, which has now, of course, been rightly declared illegal by the Court of Appeal and by the law. What is the total number of signatures? 160 to 34,431. The calculated is 969, which has always been accepted under that is the right one. Yes, the fact that he's now learned without 7 million population Greater London, no fewer than 34,000 is that the attempt to affect the outcome of the Law Lords' deliberations by providing a massive number of signatures with a total failure. It fell flat, and I think that's the truth of what we thought was what happened to the prices despite being shown they do not agree with the judgment of the House of Lords.
Wells, I think it's quite important for the Chairman to make it quite clear that some circumstances to ensure the, as is required, for instance, under the Companies Act, to ensure that in very many circumstances.
I'm very obliged to Mr. Bayes for the supplementary, and the fact is that that does reflect the policy of the committee. Bankers were contacted, and Sheba's references were taken up with the bank, and Sheba have been contacted. And I'm afraid that I think Mr. Taylor would do better if he
The efforts which he's had to keep open the Hoover factory at Perry Vale.
Of all places, I think Havering Upminster should actually use the opportunity of the tragic and uncooperative. Yes.
Well, Chairman, I'm obliged to Mr. Daniel for his supplementary, but I think he must be a bit more in London. I think it's understandable that Mr. Bayes would use the opportunity to travel on it to see areas of London with which he might not otherwise be familiar.
Quite honestly, I think the area of representation is entirely irrelevant to the purpose of this question. What we have here is obviously a vast amount of council effort. How much more time does the chairman of this committee propose to direct staff in pursuance of objectives which...
Deducted from that London waiting is an approximate value of the free staff travel. And because in July 1981 a certain level was deducted at the council were to agree an increase in fares, in July 1982, when the thing gets renegotiated, then, unfortunately, the deduction will be greater because the value of the free staff travel will be that much greater. I explained all this after the summer recess. I'm sorry George didn't bother to listen to him.
Yeah. Mr. Edwards?
Chairman, through you. One, which of the existing river crossings within London will they, A, be permitted to use, and B, not be permitted to use? Secondly, on London's A roads other than the above, A, how many bridges and like structures would not take the increased loading? B, at how many places would two such vehicles not be able to pass? And C, how many additional places are there?
That it deserves. I'm more than prepared to ask the Arts Committee to consider the position of the doily cart, but can give no assurances at this moment.
Mr. Watt?
I agree that in the event of the Doily Cart Opera Company being forced to revert to amateur status, they might well be recommended to take on the front bench of the minority party as the principals for future performances.
Indeed,
Sir Ashley Bramall?
Chairman of the Industry and Employment Committee, will he state, one, whether he has seen the article on the East End News in The Guardian on the 31st of December 1981, two, whether the report of the state of East End News is accurate, and three, what the Council's involvement with East End News has been?
Chairman, the answer to one is yes. The answer to 2 is I believe the report to be accurate as to the state of the East End News. The answer to 3, and this will take a minute or two, is that the Council received in May of last year an application from the cooperative for a grant of £25,000 towards staff, premises and general administrative costs over the period 1981 to 2 in order to consolidate its trading position as a prerequisite for expansion. The main requirement was to finance a cash short.
Yes, it was the London Transport Committee on the 6th of October 1970 has a paragraph 1 which reads, "The Leader of the Council announced at the time of the change of administration £50,000. And might well be viewed in the context of the extra tourist trade the Silver Jubilee has brought to London this year. In any event, to change..."
It appeared that that was a noble effort by the loyal Sir Horace to secure preferment, which up until now he's not been able to secure. I should be looking for the next honours list. But will the Chairman accept from me that I believe this figure to be unrealistically low and does not take into consideration all the knock-on costs arising from additional works necessary to make the change of name? And will he ask the officers to...
Suspicious of them. Whatever his good intentions may have been at that time, the fact is he has again, his party have again created the most chaotic situation that one could possibly envisage. In fact, I heard somebody a moment ago when we were having questions saying how much the Labour Party had done in their 8 months of office. I think they have done sweet Fanny Adams. That's what I think. And I think they have done this, they have done a disservice to London, the greatest magnitude that I could possibly think. They have brought us into disrepute. We have heard the leader cavorting and pontificating on every possible subject that has nothing to do with this authority, instead of getting on with this authority's business. And it is on this ground that we say that we deplore the chaotic mess that they have created. And if Mr. Livingstone thinks that we are going to pull his hot chestnuts out of the fire so that he can get off the griddle, he has got another think coming this afternoon.
Let him fry. Officers, that to comply with the law, the Council will have to seek a further fare increase of between 50 and 100% later during this year. Now, London Transport have submitted figures to us that show the damage that that will do to London's transport. It could mean the loss of up to 40% of passengers from public transport in London. And we don't believe that all we can do is sit here and pretend, as the Tory party does, that somehow none of this has happened and all we've got to do is go back to the world that existed before the Tories lost the last election. The nature of the law and its interpretation has changed in a way that renders many of the budgets of last councils, of previous administrations, questionable in law. And that is the advice of our officers. Now, it is up to each member of the council to decide for themselves whether they can accept that advice and the implications it has for Londoners. My own views, I think, are well known. I do not intend to vote for a fare increase or for these dramatic cuts in services, which would eventually lead to a major job loss. That will do nothing to help the quality of life in London. The Labour Party has faced today and yesterday a major debate within its own ranks about how we should respond to the crisis that now faces London. And there are two quite clear views that have emerged, and our group is fairly equally divided on those. There are those who share my view that these measures are so appalling that we cannot bring ourselves to vote for them, even though that means that we put ourselves outside of the law. I speak for myself personally and no one else when I say that I cannot find it in myself to vote to comply with a decision which does so much damage to the interests of Londoners. Not just damage to public transport, but long-term damage to industry and commerce in London when road congestion dramatically increases. There are other members of the Labour Party who make it quite clear that their respect for the rule of law and the safeguards they see in the rule of law for society as a whole means that however bad that decision is, they feel that they should support the decision of implementing the Law Lords' interpretation of London Transport Act, whatever the consequences. But every member of the Labour Party is determined that this resolution before us today shall go through, because it throws the whole resources of the Council into a campaign aimed at restoring the position of London Transport and our ability to finance it to what we believed it was, and what Mrs Thatcher believed it was, and what the Tory Secretary of State for Transport believed it was before Lord Denning and the Law Lords. And it is interesting that in all the debates in Parliament that took place, not just when the London Transport Act was set up, and Mrs Thatcher made quite clear in that debate that we had, as the GLC, the right to subsidise London Transport, but in the debates that took place when members of the House of Commons were debating our fares cut, although Mrs Thatcher and Norman Fowler, who was then Transport Secretary, made it quite clear they totally opposed our fares cut, no Conservative Member of Parliament ever suggested that we did not have the legal powers to take that position. And that is the problem we face. It is very easy now for the Tory party in this chamber or in government to sit back, to wash its hands and say, well, let's hope all the odium sticks on the Labour Party. But the crisis we face here in London is not one that any one party should simply exploit for its own partisan advantage. I don't believe that the Tory party will win votes at the next election if it sits back and watches the tremendous contraction that there will be in public transport in London. I don't believe we would benefit or win popular support in London if we merely sat back and said, that's it, we blame it all on the government, on the Law Lords, and do nothing to change it. We intend, as a Labour group, to fight in a completely united position outside of this chamber to mobilise popular support so that the government is forced to produce the amending legislation which, firstly, will save the position of the pensioners' bus passes, secondly, will allow us to continue to subsidise London transport so that we can have reasonable levels of fares, and thirdly, so that we can make subsidies available so that, having got cheap fares, there are actually sufficient buses and tubes being run for the public to be able to use those cheap fares. It will be no good the government conceding perhaps the most obvious part of that, which is the pensioners' bus passes, if at the end of the day the contraction in service has been so massive that pensioners are unable to use the bus passes to freely travel around London. Now, I urge all my colleagues that this is not an issue which should divide the Labour Party with acrimony. There is no Labour member in this chamber today that would willingly vote to increase fares. Every Labour member remains committed to the view that in order to have a city worth living in, we need to have fare levels dramatically lower than they will be if these fares are increased today. No Labour member would willingly go back on that manifesto. But as one who faces a surcharge risk, I know the enormity of the pressures that are brought to bear on members to comply with laws, whether they are good or bad. And I have no intention of joining or subscribing or taking part in any witch hunts inside or outside this building against people who, on this key issue of compliance with the Law Lords, find they do not agree with the position I take. And I hope that we can proceed on a basis of mutual respect, because we are here today for one basic purpose: to launch the campaign which will reverse the terrible position that now faces London Transport and save London Transport from a catastrophic decline. Because at the end of the day, it will not be members of this council who suffer if London Transport goes down the pan. It will be millions of ordinary Londoners who depend on the London Transport Service for a decent ability to be able to move around the city. And I say one word about Bromley. And that is some interesting information has come to light. Bromley is a borough where there is a substantial amount of British rail service. We have asked what the level of subsidy is that the government gives to British Rail in order to allow suburban trains to run through Bromley. It is 40%, just about the same level of subsidy that we are providing to London Transport up until today. We would be quite happy to accept the same level of subsidy for London transport from this council that the government is giving to British Rail. Instead, government has done everything possible to prevent our policy working. It has refused to allow us to make a subsidy available to London transport. It now says it is going to do nothing to help us out of this problem, and the people opposite seek to exploit it for a narrow partisan advantage. That will not be the position on the Labour benches. Whatever we may feel as individuals about whether or not we should comply with the decision of the Law Lords, we remain united that the policy we put before the electorate and which won that election is a policy we should be allowed to continue, and even if today we face a setback, we shall mobilise the resources in London that eventually lead to us being able to continue with that policy, because we believe it is in the interests of Londoners.
Chairman, thank you very much. The Leader of the Council, in fact, is entirely to blame.
The purposes the opposition are perpetrating if they lead people to believe that the House of Lords' decisions does not mean that the effective power to control London transport fares has been taken away from the Greater London Council.
This will increase fares by 36% over the level that existed in September 1980. Or allowing for inflation and so forth, Chairman, but excluding the massive deficit incurred during the fares cut period, it will be a rise of something like 12.5% in real terms. Chairman, that is the price that London will now pay for the Labour Party's refusal to accept a fair balance between ratepayer and traveller. Chairman, to that extent, the difference that Londoners will pay next March, as compared with the prices they were paying last March, inflation apart, is truly the cost of a Labour London. It is truly, Chairman, the Livingston supplement.
London Transport said it was illegal, but our legal department said it was illegal. And therefore we won't... Well, no good shaking your head, Harold. You're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, so therefore we have to take legal advice. If you are it's no good showing me papers. Well, Lord Wilberforce sounded as confused as some of the Tory in front of me. But it is a fact that our legal department says the 1981 budget was illegal. Now, for God's sake, don't be so damn stupid. Now,
carry on, Mr. Kerr.
Yes, party. And this majority party have a right to say to these 5 elected gentlemen, go and take a running jump.
Mr. Judge. Mr. Judge. Mr. Lemkin, I have sat in this chair 1 minute and I've been accused of letting 4 people speak. Please do not join the ranks of the imbeciles. Please. On a point of order, I've only just sat in this chair and you're starting already. Please don't. Not today. Mr. Judge, carry on.
Lemkin, sit down.
One side and then the other side. We have not spoken on this side for 4 speeches.
That is not a point of order. You're trying to educate me and you are not capable. Thank you. Mr. Judge.
Mr. Chairman, of the Conservative Party, every word that they wrote appears to meet with the wholehearted disapproval of the Labour Party. So it must be sheer coincidence that they appear to have hit right down the political centre. But they are not party political, and far be it from me ever to say so. What does concern me, and what has not come out in this debate so far, is that, apart from the question of the fiduciary duty to the ratepayers,